We continue our journey into the depths of time, to the very origins of one of the greatest civilizations of antiquity. Last time, we spoke of the dawn of life in the Nile Valley, of the mysterious cultures of the deserts, and of the long struggle for power, crowned by the unification of Egypt under the scepter of the legendary King Narmer. But what happened next? How did this nascent state grow into the mighty empire of the Old Kingdom, the era of the builders of the Great Pyramids? How did the pharaohs manage not only to govern a vast country, but also to instill in millions of people a belief in their divine essence? Today, we will unveil the secrets of the first Egyptian dynasties. We will learn how the world's first state machine was created, with its officials, taxes, and censuses. We will talk about the invention of writing and its role in consolidating power. We will peek into the luxurious and simultaneously gruesome tombs of the first pharaohs in Abydos, where kings were accompanied into the afterlife by their slain servants. We will trace the rises and falls of the early dynastic period, civil unrest, and the new unification of the country under the rule of Khasekhemwy, who prepared the ground for Djoser and Imhotep. We will see how the unique Egyptian monarchy was formed, combining sacrality and cruelty, grandiose construction, and ruthless exploitation. Prepare to learn how the foundation was laid for 3,000 years of pharaonic rule, and what secrets the era of ancient Egypt's formation holds. No one, ever in history, has managed to maintain state power for a long time, relying solely on brute force or only on a single ideology, however well thought out and all-encompassing it might be. For any political regime aspiring to long and successful rule, the most crucial guarantee of stability is the establishment of effective control over the economic and productive life of the country. It is this control that allows the authorities not only to extract the necessary resources for their existence and the realization of ambitious projects, but also, equally importantly, to strengthen their legitimacy in the eyes of their subjects by demonstrating the ability to ensure order, prosperity, and protection. The ancient rulers of Egypt, the founders of the first dynasty and their successors, understood this truth perfectly. They made considerable, purposeful, and systematic efforts to gain the ability to dispose not only of the fates and lives of their subjects, as we saw in the example of ritual killings, but also of all their means of subsistence: land, water, harvest, craft production, and trade. One of the most significant and long-lasting achievements of the pharaohs of the first three dynasties, who ruled Egypt throughout the early dynastic period and the beginning of the Old Kingdom, was precisely the creation and gradual strengthening of a centralized state in a sense already close to our familiar understanding, with a unified territory, a capital, an administrative apparatus, a tax system, an army, and an official ideology. In historical literature, this most important period of the formation and consolidation of the ancient Egyptian state, covering the reigns of the first and second dynasties, is known as the Early Dynastic Period, or the Thinite period, after the supposed native region of the first kings, Thinis, and it lasted approximately 400 years, from 2950 to 2575 BCE. It is precisely at the beginning of this period, with the unification of the country under Narmer, that the long and complex process of Egypt's political centralization, which began in the pre-dynastic era, concludes. King Narmer and his immediate successors on the throne of unified Egypt, such as Aha, Jer, Jet, and Den, faced an entirely new and extremely complex problem: the need to effectively govern a vast, newly created country, which was a narrow but incredibly long strip of land stretching almost 800 kilometers along the Nile, from the first cataracts in the south, near the border with Nubia, to the very shores of the Mediterranean Sea in the north, in the vast delta. It was necessary not only to keep this gigantic territory with its diverse population and local traditions under control, but also to create working mechanisms for governance, tax collection, maintenance of order, and border defense. By the end of the early dynastic era, that is, by the time of the reign of the last kings of the second dynasty, such as Khasekhemwy, the central royal authority, having passed through periods of flourishing, crises, and new unification, managed to establish virtually complete control over the main sectors of the country's economy. This control allowed the kings to accumulate colossal material and human resources in their hands, which, in turn, gave them the ability to finance and carry out grandiose construction projects, including the erection of the first monumental stone. Structures such as funerary complexes and, ultimately, the pyramids themselves. All this became possible thanks to a combination of several factors: exceptional determination, political will, administrative talent, innovation in ideology and technology, and of course, not least, the boundless ambition and desire for eternal glory of the first Egyptian kings themselves and their closest associates. Among all the great inventions of human thought that changed the course of history, the invention of writing holds a truly special, fundamental place. It is practically impossible to overestimate the enormous, truly transformative significance that the appearance and spread of writing had for the development of any human society, whether in the sphere of accumulating and transmitting knowledge, from generation to generation, in the field of state administration and control, in the development of trade and law, or in recording historical events and preserving cultural memory. For modern man, living in a world literally permeated with written information in all its forms, from books and newspapers to the internet and messages on the phone, it is already extremely difficult to even imagine a world in which written transmission of information is completely absent, where all knowledge is transmitted only orally, and management and accounting are carried out only with the help of memory and primitive counting devices. But for the ancient Egyptians, who lived at the turn of the 4th and 3rd millennia BCE, the invention, or possibly the borrowing and adaptation of a writing system, was a truly revolutionary discovery that radically changed their civilization and opened up entirely new horizons for it. We, unfortunately, are unlikely to ever know all the precise details and circumstances of the emergence of the unique Egyptian hieroglyphic script. However, the archaeological facts at our disposal, primarily the finds of the earliest written monuments, indicate quite definitely that this great discovery was not an absolutely random or instantaneous event, but rather the result of a long process of experiments and searches stimulated by the pressing needs of the emerging state and its elite. As already mentioned, in the royal tomb Uj at Abydos, belonging to one of the powerful pre-dynastic rulers of Upper Egypt, who lived about a century and a half before Narmer, around 3200 BCE, hundreds of small bone and wooden tags were found with the earliest known examples of genuine hieroglyphic writing. In these very short, but already quite readable messages, already well-developed and recognizable hieroglyphic signs are used, denoting both specific objects and numbers, as well as some sounds and concepts. The writing system itself, represented on these tags, already demonstrates that characteristic complexity and mixed ideographic phonetic principle that would distinguish Egyptian hieroglyphics throughout all subsequent 3,500 years of its existence. The long-standing and still not definitively resolved question of where true writing first appeared in the world, in ancient Egypt or in ancient Sumer, in Mesopotamia, still remains a subject of lively scholarly debate. However, most modern researchers, based on the dating of the oldest written monuments from both regions, are inclined to believe that this honor, most likely, still belongs to the inhabitants of southern Mesopotamia, the Sumerians, and in particular, to the priests and scribes of the city of Uruk, which flourished at the end of the 4th millennium BCE, where the oldest clay tablets with Proto-Sumerian pictographic writing used for economic accounting were found. It is possible, as some scholars suggest, that a few centuries before the unification of Egypt, during a period of intense cultural contacts between the Nile Valley and Mesopotamia, the Egyptians, along with other important borrowings such as cylinder seals or the palace facade architectural style, also adopted from the Sumerians the very revolutionary idea of writing as a way of recording information using conventional signs. But this does not at all mean that they directly borrowed the Sumerian writing system itself, cuneiform. On the contrary, the unique Egyptian hieroglyphic script with its picturesque sign drawings was a completely original creation and perfectly adapted to the phonetic and grammatical needs of the Egyptian language specifically. And its amazing hieroglyphic signs themselves depicted the characteristic features of the world surrounding the ancient Egyptians: flora, fauna, household items, people, and gods of the Nile Valley, so accurately, in such detail, and so recognizably that there can be no question of their direct external Mesopotamian origin. Most likely, what happened is what scientists call diffusion of an idea. The Egyptians learned about the very fact of the existence of writing from their eastern neighbors and, realizing its enormous possibilities, independently created their own, completely unique writing system, perfectly suited to their language and culture. One could, of course, purely hypothetically imagine some brilliant sage or scribe at the court of one of the powerful pre-dynastic kings of Egypt, who with enthusiasm and curiosity studies the strange, incomprehensible signs covering clay tablets or cylinder seals brought from distant Mesopotamia. He concludes that these signs can be used not only for accounting, but also for transmitting knowledge, thoughts, and speech itself, and decides to create a similar sign system, but for his native Egyptian language, using images of familiar objects and creatures as signs. As a somewhat, albeit not very successful, and much later, historical analogy of such a conscious invention of a national script based on an external model, one might perhaps cite the semi-legendary story of the creation of the Korean phonetic alphabet Hangul by the Korean King Sejong the Great and his court scholars in 1443 CE, who are believed to have been inspired by Mongolian and Chinese writing. However, there are other, possibly more convincing scientific theories explaining such an unexpected and rapid appearance of an already fully formed and complex hieroglyphic script in Egypt at the turn of the 4th and 3rd millennia BCE, for example, theories about its gradual development from earlier systems of signs and symbols used for ritual or accounting purposes. Whatever the exact circumstances and time of the appearance of hieroglyphic writing in the Nile Valley, the first pharaohs of unified Egypt and their administrators very quickly realized its enormous potential, not only as a means for economic accounting, but also as a most powerful tool of state power, administration, and propaganda. And they did not fail to use it widely and effectively to strengthen their control over the country. For that distant and turbulent era of the early dynastic period, when the young Egyptian state waged constant wars to expand its borders and spheres of influence, as well as to suppress internal resistance, the very possibility of accurately and documentarily recording, making an inventory of its vast and constantly growing royal property, and then sharing this important information with other officials in different parts of the country through written documents was a truly amazing and revolutionary innovation, giving the central government a huge advantage. Henceforth, all diverse supplies, grain, oil, wine, textiles, livestock, metals, that flowed into the pharaoh's treasury from all over the country in the form of taxes and tribute, and all those resources that were then expended and left it for the needs of the court, army, or construction could be accurately accounted for and marked with special seals and inscriptions containing the Horus name of the reigning king, which sharply increased control and prevented theft. Various materials and products intended for the construction and supply of the royal tomb were now also affixed with the bone or wooden tags already familiar to us, indicating not only the name of the king owner but also other important administrative information, the exact contents of the vessel or box, its quantity or weight, an indication of the grade or quality of the product, as well as the place and year of its manufacture or collection. Developed initially, apparently, as a purely practical means for the needs of economic accounting and administration within the expanding royal and temple estates, writing was received with genuine enthusiasm and actively implemented by the ancient Egyptians, who, by all appearances, were always distinguished by a certain formalism, pedantry, and love for order and accounting in business matters. In the conditions of ancient Egypt, where the ability to read and write hieroglyphs and their cursive variants remained an extremely complex art requiring long years of study, literacy was always the privilege of a very small ruling elite, the royal family, high officials, priests, and professional scribes. Therefore, to become a scribe, that is, a person who perfectly mastered the art of reading and writing, meant not just to obtain a respected profession, but also to gain direct access to the levers of power, to state service, to knowledge, and to the possibility of career growth. Such a close associative link between literacy, knowledge, and power was formed in the public consciousness of the Egyptians at the very dawn of their history, and was preserved throughout all subsequent millennia. The emergence and rapid spread of writing in Egypt had a huge impact, not only on internal administration and culture, but also on the development of foreign trade and international relations of the young state. Most of those unique bone and wooden tags with early hieroglyphic inscriptions found in the royal tombs of the first dynasty at Abydos, which, by the way, thanks to the scenes of various royal rituals and events depicted on them, are also the most important monuments of early Egyptian culture and history, were originally attached to large ceramic jars containing high-quality olive oil or wine, which were imported into Egypt from countries of the eastern Mediterranean, most likely from Canaan, i.e., from the territory of modern Syria, Lebanon, Israel, and Palestine. The very fact of the presence of such a large quantity of imported goods in the earliest royal tombs testifies to active and well-established foreign trade already in the time of the first dynasty. This noticeable increase in imports of strategically important products, such as oil, wine, and especially timber, cedar and pine, which were scarce in Egypt itself, could be directly related to the appearance in this period of the first Egyptian. Permanent or semi-permanent trading posts, guard posts, and even small colonies in southern Palestine, on the territory of modern Israel and the Gaza Strip. Numerous archaeological finds made in places such as Nahal Tila, Tel Arani, Tel Sakan, and En Besor unequivocally indicate the active presence of Egyptian officials, merchants, and artisans in this region at the end of the 4th, beginning of the 3rd millennium BCE. Here were discovered not only imported Egyptian ceramic vessels, some of which were even marked with a serech bearing the Horus name of King Narmer himself, but also a large number of locally produced Canaanite clay items, which, however, were made in a typically Egyptian style and using Egyptian technology, and some of them even bore imprints of Egyptian cylinder seals or incised hieroglyphs. This speaks of strong Egyptian cultural and economic influence in the region. On the En Besor River or stream near modern Gaza, the Egyptians apparently created a fairly large and well-organized supply center for their trade caravans heading north, and possibly an administrative center to control the local population. For this, they actively used the so-called coastal road, or Way of Horus, an ancient trade route that ran along the Mediterranean coast between Palestine and the eastern Nile Delta. Thus, the very first Egyptian pharaohs pursued an active and purposeful foreign policy, seeking to establish control over important trade routes and sources of raw materials in neighboring regions. Thanks to a skillful combination of military force, diplomacy, trade, and state patronage of economic ties, the foreign policy of early dynastic Egypt reached a qualitatively new imperial level, laying the foundations for future conquests and domination in the Near East and Nubia. However, the same cannot be said of the official state ideology, which in relation to the outside world remained surprisingly conservative, insular, and xenophobic. Among their own subjects, the pharaohs and their ideologues constantly and insistently maintained the illusion of Egypt's so-called splendid isolation, its complete self-sufficiency and superiority over all other peoples of the world, who were considered wild, chaotic, and hostile. According to official religious doctrine, the paramount role of the pharaoh as protector of the divinely established world order of Ma'at in Egypt, and Egypt, in their view, was the entire civilized world, inevitably included waging constant, just, and victorious wars against Egypt's neighbors, Libyans to the west, Asiatics to the northeast, and Nubians to the south. All these foreign peoples in official ideology and art invariably personified hostile forces of chaos, constantly threatening to violate Egypt's sacred borders and destroy the order established by the pharaoh, and therefore had to be ruthlessly subdued and annihilated. To instill and constantly maintain in their subjects a strong sense of national pride, unity, and identity, as well as loyalty to the ruling regime, the Egyptian ruling circles from the very beginning acted as many rulers and ideologues throughout. World history would later do. They simply declared all foreigners indiscriminately to be backward barbarians and potential enemies. On the small bone plaque from Narmer's royal tomb in Abydos, which we have already mentioned, we see, for example, the depiction of some Asiatic possibly Palestinian dignitary, who is shown respectfully bowing before the Egyptian pharaoh seated on his throne as if acknowledging his superiority. But, as we know from other archaeological sources of the same period, in reality, Egypt and Palestine were already linked by very close and mutually beneficial trade and cultural relations. So, under the mask of official xenophobic ideology, which depicted all foreigners as enemies to be conquered, often lay a completely different, much more complex and pragmatic reality of active international contacts. This discrepancy between ideological declarations and actual practice should serve as an important methodological warning for all modern researchers of ancient Egypt. For from the earliest times to the very end of their history, the Egyptians were unsurpassed masters of propaganda and the skillful presentation of any events, especially military or political ones, in an exclusively favorable light for themselves. Therefore, their written sources and official depictions, however valuable and informative they may be, always require a strictly critical approach and must be constantly evaluated and rechecked with an eye on more objective and impartial archaeological evidence literally dug out of the ground by the archaeologist's spade. If in relations with the rich and relatively developed city-states of the Near East, with which Egypt had no common land border, the Egyptian pharaohs from the very beginning had to show some flexibility and maintain mainly peaceful trade and diplomatic relations. Then with Nubia, a country lying directly south of Egypt, beyond the first Nile cataract, everything was much simpler and harsher. Egypt had an extensive common border with Nubia, and this country was rich in resources vital to Egypt, primarily gold, as well as copper, hard stone, ivory, ebony, exotic animals, and, not least, people who could be used as slaves or mercenary warriors. Therefore, from the very beginning of its history, Egypt sought to establish its complete military and economic dominance over this southern region. Interestingly, the first proto-state formations in lower, i.e., northern Nubia itself, known as the A-group culture, with its centers at Sayala and Kustul, emerged at approximately the same time in the mid-4th millennium BCE, when Egypt's own first pre-dynastic city kingdoms, such as Thinis, Nubt, and Nekhen, were rising. The fact of the existence in Nubia during this period of its own, quite sophisticated material culture, rich royal or chieftainly burials with symbols of power similar to Egyptian ones, and evidence of systematic trade with neighbors, including Egypt itself, as evidenced by finds of Egyptian goods in Nubian tombs and vice versa, undoubtedly speaks of the emergence here of its own autochthonous civilization and statehood. However, this early Nubian civilization was not destined to develop into a great power capable of rivaling Egypt. Both written, more precisely pictorial, and archaeological sources quite eloquently tell us the sad story of one of the first and most brutal military conquests undertaken by Egypt against its southern neighbor. The earliest pharaohs of unified Egypt, beginning perhaps even with Narmer's predecessors, seeking unlimited access to Nubian resources, especially gold, to establish full control over trade routes leading further south into Africa, and to eliminate a potential rival on their southern border, dealt a devastating military blow to the local Nubian proto-states of the A-group culture. They did this before the Nubians had time to consolidate and turn into a serious military threat to Egypt itself. The previously mentioned rock relief at Jebel Sheikh Suleiman in Nubia, depicting a defeated Nubian chieftain held in the claws of a giant scorpion, a symbol of the Egyptian king, may serve as one of the earliest and most reliable pieces of evidence of this aggressive and expansionist policy of Egypt towards Nubia already at the end of the pre-dynastic period. A second image, carved nearby on the same rock and dating to the very beginning of the first dynasty's rule, adds the final concluding touches to this grim picture. In it, we see an Egyptian pharaoh, possibly King Djoser, triumphantly sailing in his boat, impassively gazing at the Nubian lands he has completely devastated, strewn with the corpses of the slain and the bodies of dying Nubians. With the rich and fairly strong city-states of the distant Near East, early Egyptian pharaohs preferred to conduct mutually beneficial trade and, having no common land border with them, were forced to maintain mostly peaceful diplomatic relations. But for them, to acquiesce to the existence right next door, on their southern border, of an independent and potentially strong rival neighbor, as Nubia could have become, was out of the question. After this devastating Egyptian invasion, and apparently the deliberate destruction of the local elite and culture, a whole millennium or even more would pass before Lower Nubia could recover from this blow and acquire sufficient political and military power for the revival of its statehood in the form of the Kingdom of Kerma. But even in such a revived status, Nubia would remain for mighty Egypt more of an annoyance and a source of resources than a real rival, until the era of the new kingdom, the establishment of reliable and well-guarded borders, the development of profitable international trade, and strict control over internal resources provided the early Egyptian state during the First and Second Dynasties with complete dominance over the entire Nile Valley and led to a general economic upswing and the accumulation of significant wealth in the hands of the ruling elite. However, these material benefits were distributed extremely unevenly among the country's population. Archaeological data, especially funerary rites of this time, clearly indicate a rapidly growing gap between the fabulously wealthy top of society, the king, his family, high officials, and the main mass of the common population, who lived in relative poverty. The size and richness of funerary structures and grave goods in this era directly depended on the social status and wealth of their owner, ranging from tiny pit graves for the poor to gigantic underground palaces for pharaohs. The greatest benefit from the country's political centralization was reaped, of course, by the state itself, i.e., the king and his administration, in whose direct use and disposal were practically all the main productive resources of the country, primarily vast tracts of the most fertile arable land, previously belonging to temples or communities. Ordinary peasants continued to cultivate their small plots of land, but now they increasingly fell into dependence on the state as the supreme owner of the land, or on its representatives, officials, and nobles who acted as landlords. These new masters of life exacted a heavy rent in kind or tax from the peasants for the use of land and water in the form of a significant share of the harvest. To ensure that this newly acquired fertility of Egyptian soils brought a constant and maximum possible income to the state treasury, the kings of the First Dynasty very early on created and implemented the first nationwide system of regular taxation in Egyptian history. In this important matter of centralization and accounting, as in many others, the new invention, writing, provided them with invaluable assistance. For the first time in Egyptian history, the central state authority gained the ability to begin a systematic accounting of all its subjects' property, land, livestock, people, and on this basis to levy regular and differentiated taxes on them. Some of the earliest administrative inscriptions, made in ink on clay jars and dating back to the time of Narmer himself, report the receipt of certain revenues, probably taxes or tribute, separately from Upper and Lower Egypt. This may mean that already under him, the country was administratively divided into two main parts for more effective governance and tax collection. The constant efforts of the early Egyptian government to establish its complete control over all aspects of the country's economic and social life are clearly evidenced by some other important administrative measures taken during the First Dynasty. We learn about them in particular from a unique source, the so-called Palermo Stone. This is a large fragment of an ancient royal chronicle, or annals, compiled, apparently, during the Fifth Dynasty, around 2400 BCE, but covering historical events starting from the pre-dynastic period. The earliest surviving entry on this stone, relating to the reign of one of the first kings of the First Dynasty, probably Aha, Narmer's successor, describes a certain important state procedure called Shemsu-Hor, meaning following of Horus, or accompanying Horus. This procedure, as subsequent entries show, was initially conducted regularly, once every 2 years. In all likelihood, it was a kind of solemn inspection tour of the entire Nile Valley by the pharaoh himself, Horus, and his numerous dignitaries and officials. Similar inspection trips by rulers were practiced in other ancient and medieval monarchies, for example, by the English Tudor kings. This Egyptian following of Horus tour undoubtedly pursued several important objectives simultaneously. Firstly, the pharaoh himself, appearing personally in different parts of his vast country, visibly reminded his distant subjects of his existence, his power, and the unity of the state. Secondly, the officials accompanying him had an excellent opportunity to monitor on the spot the execution of royal decrees, the maintenance of general order, and the activities of local authorities, as well as to resolve accumulated disputes and administer supreme justice in the king's name. Thirdly, and importantly, during such a tour, considerable expenses for the maintenance of the huge royal court and its retinue were covered by the resources and offerings of the local population of the regions where he stopped. Thus, during the year of the tour, the problem of feeding the court from the central treasury was partially alleviated. And last but not least, such regular inspection trips significantly facilitated the authorities' assessment of all movable and immovable property of the subjects and the subsequent collection of taxes. Later, already during the Second Dynasty, as the same annals show, the royal court officially recognized the enormous fiscal profitability of these followings of Horus. Subsequently, they began to be held annually and were combined with a formal census of the entire population and, especially importantly, of cultivated lands and livestock throughout the country. Starting from the reign of the third king of the first dynasty, Djoser, the year-by-year records on the Palermo Stone also contain regular reports on the height of the annual Nile floods, which, evidently, were already systematically measured in standard units of length, royal cubits, about 52 centimeters, and their fractions, palms and fingers. Such close attention of the central authorities to the level of the Nile floods is explained very simply. The volume of the harvest in the next agricultural season directly depended on their height, and consequently, the amount of taxes that the treasury could realistically collect, and that would enter the royal granaries. The collection of these taxes, which in ancient Egypt were almost always levied in kind, i.e., as a certain share of agricultural produce, primarily grain, but also livestock, flax, oil, wine, etc., was handled by a vast and constantly growing army of state officials of various ranks, acting on behalf of the pharaoh and his treasury. In their activities, these tax collectors, as some texts from later eras testify, often resorted to very harsh and even violent measures against the population to meet the established collection plan. The numerous imprints of cylinder and stamp seals of some high officials of the early dynastic period responsible for finances, which have survived to our time, allow us to partially reconstruct the complex and bureaucratized process of the royal treasury's work, which, apparently, from the very first centuries of the unified Egyptian state's existence, was the most important and powerful department in the country, controlling all its economic resources. The royal administration disposed of the duties and taxes collected throughout the country as follows. A certain, probably significant part of the obtained raw materials, grain, flax, animal hides, vegetable oils, went to numerous royal craft workshops for further processing. Here, state artisans produced various finished products: fat, leather, high-quality linen fabrics, bread, beer, the main food staples, woven goods, furniture, weapons, and so on. Some of these products obtained in state workshops were possibly sold or exchanged in foreign trade, the income from which went entirely to the government, while others were distributed as payment in kind for work, i.e., rations, among numerous state employees, officials, priests, soldiers, artisans. Thus, centralized funding was provided for the huge royal court, the ramified state apparatus, and all its diverse activities, including grandiose construction. The remaining, and probably largest, part of the collected agricultural produce, primarily grain, the country's main wealth, was handed over for storage in large state granaries, which were located, apparently, in all major administrative centers of Egypt. Part of this strategic grain reserve could also be used for the current maintenance of local government bodies and garrisons, but a significant portion of it was undoubtedly stored by the central authorities in case of lean years to be able to prevent widespread famine and related social upheavals by distributing grain among the population. It is difficult to say for sure what was more behind this wise and far-sighted gesture of state foresight: sincere care of the pharaoh for the welfare of his subjects, or purely self-serving political calculation, the desire to prevent riots and maintain the stability of the regime. In any case, Objectively, the country's population as a whole only benefited from such a state insurance policy, although it had to pay a very high price for this relative stability and protection from hunger in the form of heavy taxes and labor duties. But such apparently was the eternal fate of all taxpayers in all times and in all states. By introducing a system of regular nationwide taxation and accounting, the first pharaohs of Egypt gained a powerful tool for further strengthening central authority and actively undertook reforms of both agriculture and the state apparatus itself. Despite the fact that objective improvements in the country's economic and political infrastructure, such as the development of irrigation, road construction, unification of weights and measures, and maintenance of internal peace, undoubtedly contributed to some extent to improving the living conditions of ordinary Egyptians compared to previous eras of fragmentation and wars, it is still difficult not to see in the main activities of the ruling elite of the early dynastic period, primarily their own dominant desire for personal gain, accumulation of wealth, and strengthening of their unlimited power. The king and his numerous officials were primarily concerned with their own corporate and personal interests, not the welfare of the people. In the conditions of ancient Egypt, the achieved political stability and economic prosperity contributed not so much to raising the general living standards of ordinary people as to the further growth of the power and wealth of the ruling class and the implementation of increasingly ambitious and costly construction projects, primarily the erection of even more luxurious and grandiose funerary monuments, glorifying the deceased pharaoh and his associates, and not at all to improving the real living and working conditions of the main mass of the country's population. This clear orientation of state policy towards the interests exclusively of the ruling class is most evident under Pharaoh Den, who reigned in the middle of the first dynasty, around 2850 BCE. His long and, apparently, successful reign was of enormous importance for the final establishment and strengthening of the foundations of Egyptian statehood. During the 30, or even, according to some sources, more than 40 years that he was on the throne, almost all aspects of royal power and state administration underwent important changes and reforms, starting with the further development and canonization of royal titles. It was under Den that the title Nesubiti first appeared, and ending with significant innovations in the architecture of royal tombs. Of course, in retrospect, such a purely technical innovation as the appearance of an external staircase leading down into the underground burial chamber of the royal tomb at Abydos, which greatly facilitated the burial process, and the delivery of the heavy sarcophagus and inventory, seems to us today to be something rather obvious and not too important. But for that time it was a truly revolutionary architectural and ritual innovation, which not only made royal tombs more accessible, including to robbers, but also, possibly, contributed to the future idea of a monumental above-ground part of the tomb leading to an underground crypt, i.e., the very idea of a pyramid. Den's administrative reforms also did not overlook even such an apparently closed and conservative world as the royal court and administration. The Palermo Stone, our main chronicle of that time, reports the conduct under Den of the first known nationwide census of the entire population of Egypt, as well as the reorganization and redistribution of arable land, at least in the Nile Delta. This reorganization was probably accompanied by the forced resettlement of entire rural communities in order to free up the best lands for the establishment of new large royal estates, or manors, the income from which went directly to the treasury. Therefore, Pharaoh Den, despite his possible contribution to strengthening the state, could only with great difficulty be called a magnanimous and caring landowner towards his peasant subjects. The appropriation of entire vast and fertile regions in Lower Egypt as royal lands, directly managed from the center, probably preceded or accompanied even more serious and profound administrative reforms aimed at further centralizing the country. To further strengthen the central government's control over all regions of the vast country and to weaken the potential separatism of local elites, the system of provincial administrative division was, apparently, finally introduced or regularized. The entire Nile Valley and its delta were divided into a certain number of, in the classical period there were 42, administrative territorial districts, which we, following Greek tradition, call nomes. At the head of each nome stood special officials appointed directly from the center, from the capital, and responsible only to the pharaoh and his vizier. These provincial governors are usually called by the Greek term nomarchs, although their Egyptian titles could vary. It is possible that in Upper Egypt, where territorial communities had ancient roots, the boundaries of these new administrative nomes, to some extent, corresponded to the boundaries of traditional pre-dynastic proto-states or natural irrigation basins. In Lower Egypt, in the Delta, on the contrary, such an ancient template of territorial division apparently did not exist, and therefore the province's nomes here were formed by royal authority more arbitrarily, often coalescing around already existing large royal estates or temple households. Thus, by definitively replacing the old, loose, and unstable system of personal alliances and vassal dependence with a new, more rigid, unified, and organized administrative model, the pharaoh and his numerous agents significantly strengthened their real control over the entire country and its resources. These important governmental reforms, aimed at centralizing and bureaucratizing administration, continued and actively developed throughout the second half of the First Dynasty's reign and then under the Second Dynasty. The noticeable increase in the number of high dignitaries and officials at court, who were now granted state-paid luxurious burials in their own mastaba tombs next to the royal necropolis as a special privilege and sign of royal favor, undoubtedly testifies to a substantial and progressive professionalization of the entire governmental apparatus of the early dynastic period. In North Saqqara, which from the time of the Second Dynasty became the main burial place of the Memphite high nobility, the leading figures of the state, viziers, treasurers, high priests, military commanders, built for themselves gigantic and very durable tombs of sun-dried mud brick, which in scholarship became firmly known by the later Arabic name mastaba, because of their bench-like shape. These majestic and richly decorated structures, rising above the desert, were intended not only to provide their owners with a worthy burial, but also to magically guarantee them rebirth after death in the same high social status they had occupied in life, serving the pharaoh. The very characteristic external appearance of these elite tombs, their architectural decor in the palace facade style, clearly imitating the appearance of the royal white-walled palace in Memphis, unequivocally testifies to the closest connection of their owners with the royal house and their belonging to the very top of the ruling elite. It is not surprising that many, if not all, high Egyptian officials of the early dynastic period were related in one way or another to the pharaoh himself, who was and remained the sole legitimate source of all power, wealth, and status in the country. One such enormous and well-preserved mastaba in North Saqqara belongs to a man named Hemaka, who, judging by the imprints of his seals found in the tomb, performed the crucial functions of vizier, head of administration, and chief treasurer, responsible for all state revenues and expenditures, under Pharaoh Den. Among his extremely rich funerary equipment, miraculously spared by robbers, a small but elegantly inlaid wooden box particularly attracted the attention of archaeologists. Inside it, the two oldest known papyrus scrolls were discovered. Unfortunately, the scrolls themselves turned out to be blank, unwritten, but the very fact of their presence in a mid-First Dynasty tomb attests to the widespread use of papyrus as a writing material already in this early era. It is difficult to find a more vivid and illustrative example demonstrating the inseparable link between the development of writing and the strengthening of state power in Egypt at this time. The text of the oldest known extensive autobiographical inscription was carved on the stone funerary stela of one of Hemaka's successors named Merka. This Merka served under the last pharaoh of the First Dynasty, King Kaa'a, and held numerous honorary positions at court. The long list of his titles, enumerated on the stela, clearly reveals a characteristic feature of the high Egyptian bureaucracy of the entire early dynastic period. Although Merka held a number of purely administrative or courtly posts related to the direct service of the king's person, such as helmsman of the royal bark or chief of the reception hall, the most important and honorable of all his positions, judging by its place in the list, was that of priest of the king's own funerary cult. For such high-ranking officials as Merka, loyal service to the pharaoh, both during his life and after his death, was the only real opportunity to make a brilliant career and reach the pinnacles of wealth and power. This diverse and somewhat chaotic collection of various administrative, courtly, and purely spiritual titles, of which Merka, like many other nobles of that time, was proud, reflects the still rather free and not yet fully formalized organization of the bureaucratic apparatus of the early dynastic period, except, perhaps, for the treasury, where strict accounting was required. A clear demarcation of functions and specialization between different departments apparently did not yet exist. The main thing that was truly important for an official's career was his personal proximity to the pharaoh, his trust, and his favor. The enormous and majestic mastaba tombs built in North Saqqara for such high dignitaries as Hemaka, Merka, and dozens of other elite representatives of the first and second dynasties were not just a generous reward for their loyal service to the king and state. They also served as a powerful, formidable, and constant visual reminder to all inhabitants of the capital and its surroundings of the unshakable hierarchy of power and the omnipotence of the pharaoh himself, standing at its apex. Similar, though perhaps somewhat smaller, elite tombs and other symbols of royal authority were erected at this time in other important centers along the entire Nile, from Giza and Tarkhan in the north, at the apex of the delta, to distant Inerti, modern Gebeline, and Uni, modern Armont, in the south in Upper Egypt. The sudden appearance of these imposing monumental tombs, built in a unified metropolitan palace style, and sharply contrasting with the modest and squat mud brick dwellings of local rural communities, must undoubtedly have evoked in ordinary locale inhabitants a mixed feeling of fear, respect, and awe before the new central authority. This effect can perhaps be compared to the psychological impact produced on the conquered population of England by the widespread and rapid construction of Norman castles with their high stone towers and deep moats after the Norman conquest in the 11th century. The meaning and purpose were, in essence, the same: to demonstrate visibly and unequivocally to all that henceforth the entire country was under the unified, strong, and undisputed rule of one monarch and his loyal men representing him locally. Under this heavy royal ferule, the iron hand of the first pharaohs, a new centralized order was definitively established in Egypt. The last but very telling example of how this new royal authority was asserted and functioned even at its earliest stage can be seen in the organization and activity of the first known border and customs post on Egypt's southern frontier, on the island of Elephantine, at the first Nile cataract. This fortified point was built by the Egyptians to establish complete control over all movement of people and goods across the strategically important border with Nubia at the very beginning of the first dynasty's reign, possibly as early as King Aha. For the construction of the future fortress, the highest, most dominant part of the island overlooking the river was chosen, from which the entire navigable channel of the Nile and the surrounding area could be perfectly observed. It is noteworthy that this new state structure was erected directly on the site of the most ancient local sanctuary of the goddess Satet, patroness of the island, thereby completely blocking or at least severely hampering the access of the inhabitants of the surrounding Nubian settlements to their traditional place of worship. This fact, it seems, did not bother the representatives of the new ruling Egyptian elite in the slightest. Economic and political control over the border and trade routes was far more important to them than the religious feelings or rights of the local conquered population. Thus, from the very beginning of the unified Egyptian state's existence, this characteristic, somewhat arrogant, and often dismissive attitude of the pharaohs and their administration towards the needs and beliefs of the common people was formed, which would become a defining feature of their rule for the next 3,000 years. Such was the price of national unity, effective centralized administration, and relative economic prosperity for the ancient Egyptians, the establishment of the absolute, unlimited, and often ruthless despotic power of the king. The time for change had come. King Ka, the last pharaoh of the first dynasty, died around 2750 BCE, and following established custom, was buried with great pomp in the ancient royal necropolis of Abydos, in the south of the country. His grandiose funeral procession, with the king's body placed in a wooden sarcophagus, probably solemnly exited his so-called Palace of Eternity. a large funerary complex surrounded by a massive mud brick enclosure wall built not far from the necropolis, and slowly made its way to the cemetery itself, where Pharaoh Ka was to rest in his deep underground tomb among the graves of his great ancestors, the founders of the dynasty. The site chosen for the royal necropolis at Abydos, at the foot of the desert cliffs, adjoined a deep and mysterious cleft in these cliffs, the Pega ravine, which, according to ancient Egyptian beliefs, was one of the entrances to the afterlife, the realm of the god Osiris. Along with King Ka'a's body, an enormous quantity of various utensils, furniture, weapons, jewelry, and food supplies were placed in his multi-chambered burial chamber, intended to magically sustain his royal existence in the afterlife. Subsidiary graves, where his servants and courtiers were buried simultaneously with him, are still located around the perimeter of Ka'a's central burial. These unfortunate individuals, sacrificed, were to continue serving their divine master in the next world. When all funerary rituals were completed, the entrance to the royal burial chamber was securely closed with stone slabs and sealed with clay seals in the presence of Ka'a's legitimate heir, the new pharaoh who took the name Saqqara. Thus, apparently, this time a completely bloodless and legitimate transfer of supreme power occurred from one king to another, from the first to the second dynasty. At that solemn and sad moment, hardly anyone present at the funeral could have guessed that the new pharaoh Saqqara would soon usher in a completely different new era in Egyptian history. Later Egyptian chroniclers, such as Manetho, not coincidentally called him the first king of the new second dynasty. The main reason for this was his unexpected and radical decision to completely break with centuries-old tradition and abandon the sacred Abydos, where for over 3 centuries all rulers of unified Egypt, the founders of the dynasty, had been buried. Instead, he decided to move the main royal necropolis many hundreds of kilometers north to Saqqara, located on the plateau west of the new capital, Memphis. We still do not know for sure the true reasons that prompted Saqqara and his successors to make this revolutionary decision and move the royal necropolis from ancient southern Abydos to northern Saqqara. Perhaps Saqqara himself was a native of Memphis, or was closely related by blood to one of the powerful local clans of the north. Or, perhaps, it was politically important for him that his own tomb and the tombs of his descendants be located not somewhere in distant Upper Egypt, but in the very center of the unified country, at the point of contact and balance of both its parts, near the new administrative capital, Memphis. In any case, the very architecture of Saqqara's new royal tomb in Saqqara differs strikingly from the tombs of his predecessors in Abydos, and fully corresponds to its unusual location and, possibly, new ideological orientations. Whereas in former times, for the construction of royal tombs in Abydos, the Egyptians mainly used traditional and relatively fragile sun-dried mud brick. This new gigantic tomb of Saqqara was, for the first time in the history of royal burials, almost entirely carved into the hard rock of the Saqqara Plateau. Its entrance was, for the first time, oriented not arbitrarily, but precisely to the north, towards the eternal circumpolar stars, which became associated with the king's immortality. Instead of the previous relatively simple layout with a central burial chamber surrounded by many small storerooms, this new tomb is traversed by an incredibly long, straight underground corridor, symmetrically flanked on both sides by dozens of long and narrow side galleries intended for storing an enormous funerary inventory. The internal layout of this grandiose underground structure culminates in a complex enfilade of living quarters, including a bedroom, bathroom, and even a toilet, which in their planning and dimensions are strikingly reminiscent of modern, self-contained apartments or royal suites. It seems that his own comfortable posthumous existence greatly concerned King Saqqara, and in the afterlife he wanted to continue living like a king with all the familiar earthly comforts. His immediate successors on the throne of the second dynasty, pharaohs Raneb, or Nibra, and Ninachur, followed his example and also built their huge rock-cut gallery tombs in the Saqqara necropolis, continuing the new architectural tradition. Meanwhile, despite external power and stability, internal tension apparently gradually grew within Egyptian society during the second dynasty, possibly related to rivalry between the north and south or between different noble factions. This tension, in the middle of King Nincher's long reign, around 2700 BCE, judging by some indirect data, erupted into open civil unrest, or even war. The Palermo Stone, already mentioned by us, contains a very brief and vague entry under one of Nincher's regnal years about some dramatic events. Destruction of the towns of Shem-Ra and the northern settlement? The exact interpretation of this entry is unclear, but if we assume that it refers to a military conflict during which Lower Egypt, i.e., the Delta, indeed temporarily slipped from the control of the central authority in Memphis, then it becomes clear why the names of two or three pharaohs who apparently ruled immediately after Ninetjer, such as Weneg and Senej, are found only on monuments from Lower Egypt and are completely absent in the south of the country. Perhaps at this time, Egypt temporarily disintegrated again into two independent kingdoms. The cause of this schism could also have been the previous clear focus of the First Dynasty kings on the affairs and interests of their native Upper Egypt, which could have provoked an accumulation of discontent among the population and nobility of the north. In the second half of the Second Dynasty's reign, judging by all available evidence, this political and possibly ideological crisis deepened further. Approximately 3 or 4 generations after Ninetjer, the royal necropolis unexpectedly returned south to the abandoned ancient Abydos. It was there that reigning monarchs began to be buried again. Such an extraordinary decision was made by a king who, and this is a completely unique case in the entire 3,000-year history of Egypt, officially declared himself the earthly incarnation not of the traditional patron of royal power, the falcon god Horus, but of his mythological adversary, the god Set, the ancient god of the desert, chaos, and foreign lands, who was also the patron of the pre-dynastic city of Nubt Nakada. This king even changed his Horus name to a Set name, Seth Peribsen, meaning Set is the hope of all hearts. It is difficult to say for sure what exactly pushed this pharaoh to such a radical and dangerous ideological step, which effectively challenged the entire established tradition. Perhaps his personal or dynastic positions were particularly strong precisely in the south of the country, in Upper Egypt, where the cult of the god Set had been widespread since ancient times. However, in all other respects, apart from the choice of his divine patron, Pharaoh Seth Peribsen, who reigned around 2680 BCE, seems to have diligently used all the traditional attributes and symbols of Egyptian royal power. His modest in size but carefully constructed tomb at Abydos, in its layout and brick architecture, clearly copies the models of First Dynasty funerary architecture, which can be seen as a kind of nostalgic reference to the very origins of the unified Egyptian kingdom. Moreover, Seth Peribsen was the second pharaoh after King Ka to build, next to his tomb in Abydos, a separate large funerary palace of eternity, surrounded by a massive brick enclosure. Thus, all the material monuments of this troubled time at our disposal unequivocally testify to the activation of powerful centrifugal forces in the Egyptian state. The country, unified with such difficulty and bloodshed by the first pharaohs, was apparently once again split into warring factions, and the sacred institution of divine kingship itself underwent the most serious ideological trials for the first time since the pre-dynastic wars of unification. Now, as never before, Egypt needed a new, strong, and charismatic ruler of Narmer's type, who would be capable of once again uniting the divided country by force and authority, reconciling warring factions, and restoring to the institution of monarchy its lost unity and greatness. And such a man soon indeed appeared on the historical stage. He was Khasekhemwy, the last known pharaoh of the Second Dynasty, who reigned around 2670 BCE. Without the activity of this outstanding and energetic ruler, Khasekhemwy, or, as he later began to call himself, Khasekhemwy, ancient Egyptian civilization might never have successfully passed this critical stage of its early formation, and the subsequent glorious era of the Old Kingdom with its great pyramids might not have occurred. His very original name, Khasekhemwy, which can be translated as the appearance or radiance of power or the scepter, perfectly reflects the ambitious plans of this pharaoh, which, by all accounts, he managed to fully realize during his reign. Khasekhemwy played an absolutely key, pivotal role in ancient Egyptian history, as it was essentially under him that the final transition took place from the still largely archaic culture of the Early Dynastic Period, which inherited many features of the distant prehistoric past, to the new, much more developed, monumental, and progressive civilization of the Old Kingdom, which ushered in the era of the Great Pyramids. Like his possible predecessor and rival Seth Peribsen, Khasekhemwy, in all probability, was also a native of southern Egypt, where the main center of his power was located. He paid special attention, like the very first kings, to the ancient sacred city of Nekhen, or Hierakonpolis, the ancestral home of the god Horus. He dedicated 2 magnificent statues of himself and numerous stone vessels with inscriptions to the local temple of Horus. And near the city, he erected a huge and enigmatic massive structure of sun-dried brick, which received the conventional designation fort from archaeologists. This so-called fort at Hierakonpolis is one of the oldest and best-preserved large brick structures in the world. Its powerful 10-meter-high walls have stood in the desert for over 4,500 years. Moreover, which was particularly important from an ideological point of view, Khasekhemwy decisively restored the traditional system of royal titles, based on the cult of the god Horus, and again declared himself his earthly incarnation, which unequivocally testifies to his firm desire to rule the entire country according to ancient, time-honored customs, and to put an end to the religious schism associated with Seth Peribsen. However, what was decisive for the further historical fate of Egypt was not so much the formal observance of traditions as his firm and unwavering decision to once again unite the entire divided country under his sole rule by force. The 2 aforementioned life-size stone statues of the king, found in Hierakonpolis, depict him seated on a throne in the tight-fitting ritual garment that pharaohs wore on the occasion of celebrating their Jubilee of Rain, the Hebsed festival, one of the oldest and most important royal festivals, symbolizing the renewal of the king's and the entire country's strength. It is noteworthy that on the pedestals of both these statues, instead of the traditional laudatory titles of the king, contorted and defeated figures of his numerous enemies are shown, and the brief inscriptions accompanying these images report an incredible number of slain enemies, 47,209 northern enemies. On 2 other stone vessels from the same temple in Hierakonpolis, the vulture goddess of Upper Egypt, Nekhbet, is depicted, proudly seated on the heraldic sign of the Serech, within which the word rebels is inscribed in hieroglyphs, and an explanatory inscription nearby reads, "In the year of the subjugation of Lower Egypt." Apparently, all these sources quite eloquently inform us of Khasekhemwy's large and bloody military campaign against the rebellious north of the country, i.e., the Delta, and of his subsequent complete and brutal victory and subjugation of the rebels. Khasekhemwy symbolically marked this successful and final reunification of both lands with a solemn change of his name and titles. He now began to be called Khasekhemwy, meaning the appearance or radiance of 2 powers, or 2 scepters, adding to this name a new conciliatory epithet, he in whom the 2 gods are pacified or satisfied. And his royal heraldic sign, the Serech, was now surmounted not by 1 but by 2 symbols, both the traditional falcon of the god Horus and the animal of the god Set, his recent adversary. This was a clear sign that the turmoil and schism were over, order and unity in the country were restored, and all enemies, both external and internal, had bowed before the indisputable will and power of the king. A direct and inevitable consequence of this new political consolidation of the country under Khasekhemwy's firm hand was a noticeable revival of its economic and cultural life. The central government once again established strict and effective control over all the resources of the vast country. The Palermo Stone informs us of the restoration under Khasekhemwy of the practice of a regular nationwide census, the purpose of which was the accurate accounting of gold and land, i.e., both the mineral and agricultural wealth of all Egypt, necessary to replenish the treasury. Having well replenished the treasury through taxes and, possibly, war booty, The Egyptians were able to restore and significantly expand their foreign trade relations without much difficulty, especially with the eastern Mediterranean region. But now, the main goal of their trade expeditions was not so much southern Palestine as the rich and prosperous Phoenician port city of Keben, known to the Greeks as Byblos, modern Jebel on the coast of Lebanon. Byblos was the main supplier to treeless Egypt of such a strategically important material as high-quality Lebanese cedar wood. To strengthen and demonstrate his friendly and mutually beneficial relations with this important trading partner, Khasekhemwy even sent a stone vessel with his name carved on it as a gift to the local temple of Byblos. Merchants from Byblos, in turn, actively supplied Egypt not only with the cedar and pine logs so necessary for building large ships and making sarcophagi, but also, possibly, other goods such as copper and tin necessary for bronze production. Cedar wood was particularly important for the development of Egyptian shipbuilding, as Egypt itself always experienced an acute shortage of its own high-quality timber, and large sea-going ships were so necessary both for conducting long-distance maritime trade with eastern Mediterranean countries and for military expeditions. An inscription on the Palermo Stone, dating to Khasekhemwy's 17th year of reign, i.e., around 2655 BCE, reports his construction of a large ship, possibly made of imported cedar. Evidence of the revival of tin trade, necessary for bronze production, can be found in the unique artifacts from Khasekhemwy's own royal burial at Abydos, an elegant bronze bowl and ewer for libations. To date, these are the oldest known items made of true bronze, an alloy of copper and tin, found in the Nile Valley. The discovery and mastery of this advanced bronze production technology, which was much harder and stronger than pure copper, as well as a significant increase in state revenues from renewed international trade, undoubtedly served as a powerful stimulus for further activation of Pharaoh Khasekhemwy's own construction activities. Without any exaggeration, it can be said that this last king of the Second Dynasty was one of the most energetic and tireless builders in the entire early history of ancient Egypt, preparing the ground for even more grandiose achievements by his successors. Throughout Upper Egypt, he erected or rebuilt new temples of stone or brick, and the ancient sanctuary of the god Horus at Hierakonpolis was finally completed and richly decorated. Like his predecessor Seth Peribsen, Khasekhemwy built his royal tomb not in Saqqara, but again in the ancient necropolis of Abydos, emphasizing his connection with the founders of the dynasty. Next to the tomb, he also erected a huge funerary complex, the so-called Shunet-ez-Zabib, surrounded by a massive brick wall with niches in the palace facade style. Even the famous brick fort at Hierakonpolis pales in comparison to this gigantic enclosure of Khasekhemwy's tomb at Abydos, a significant part of which still stands today, astonishing with its size and preservation. In the construction of Khasekhemwy's underground tomb itself, his architects were clearly guided by new, innovative solutions, boldly combining in it the architectural traditions of both the First Dynasty, tomb at Abydos, and the beginning of the Second Dynasty, gallery layout characteristic of Saqqara. The pharaoh seemed to want to emphasize that his reign summed up all the preceding turbulent development of Egyptian civilization and opened a new era. He seemed to peer far into the future. His central burial chamber was, for the first time in the history of royal tombs, completely lined with carefully worked and fitted blocks of dressed limestone, not brick or wood as before. This was done on an unprecedented scale and with unprecedented quality. In other words, Khasekhemwy's tomb, with its monumentality, use of stone, and complex layout, was clearly ahead of its time, anticipating the architecture of the Old Kingdom. Previously, many scholars believed that Khasekhemwy, being a southerner, limited his main construction activities only to Upper Egypt. But, as recent archaeological excavations and studies of satellite imagery have shown, he apparently also built grandiose structures in the north, in the area of the capital Memphis, far from the famous Saqqara necropolis and from all modern tourist routes, in an inaccessible place where even local camel drivers do not venture. In the sands of the Libyan desert lie the almost completely sand-covered ruins of some truly gigantic, rectangular structure. Although its massive outer walls are clearly visible on aerial photographs and satellite images, on the ground they are perceived only as a low, barely noticeable ridge of hills. The dimensions of this enigmatic structure are simply impressive. Its length is approximately 800 meters, and its width about 400 meters. It is not surprising that local residents have long called this place Djoser el-Mudir, which in Arabic means enclosure of the ruler, or dwelling of the master. Partial archaeological excavations conducted here in recent years have shown that its outer walls were built of huge, roughly hewn stone blocks, laid in inclined rows one on top of another, and the corners of the structure were additionally reinforced with rows of better quality masonry on lime mortar. So far, no inscriptions have been found during excavations that would allow accurately dating the construction of Djoser el-Mudir and identifying its creator. But it is very likely, judging by the style of masonry and grandiose scale, that this enigmatic and unfinished structure was erected precisely under the last king of the Second Dynasty, Khasekhemwy. Thus, this could be the third known gigantic monumental structure from his reign, along with the fort at Hierakonpolis and the enclosure of the tomb at Abydos. Undoubtedly, if this structure had been completed, it would have become the largest and most impressive man-made monument Egypt had ever seen up to that time. The country, newly unified and pacified by Khasekhemwy's firm hand, clearly stood on the threshold of a new great era in its history, the era of pyramid construction. And indeed, very soon the early dynastic period gave way to the era of the Old Kingdom, marked by the erection of the first pyramid. Today, almost no trace remains of the former unrealized grandeur of the gigantic Djoser el-Mudir structure. The reason for this deplorable state was not the negligence or incompetence of its builders, but the appearance nearby of an even more grandiose and innovative monument, the famous step pyramid of King Netjereket, better known by his later name, Djoser. The creators of the first Egyptian pyramid, like their numerous descendants throughout Egyptian history, without much remorse saw in the neighboring, possibly unfinished or abandoned royal monument a convenient and easily accessible source of ready-made building stone. Without bothering with the grueling and lengthy work in distant quarries, they simply dismantled the walls of Djoser el-Mudir and used its massive stone blocks to construct their own, even taller, more complex, and ideologically significant funerary monument. The result of this creative and pragmatic approach was the famous step pyramid of Djoser at Saqqara, which to this day defines our understanding of the third dynasty of Egyptian pharaohs, who ruled from approximately 2650 to 2575 BCE. Pharaoh Netjereket himself, whom we more often call Djoser, for whom this first pyramid in the world was created, reigned from approximately 2650 to 2620 BCE. He was, apparently, the son or close relative of his predecessor, Khasekhemwy, and not only inherited from him the throne of a unified and pacified Egypt, as well as his passion for monumental stone constructions, he clearly decided to surpass and eclipse all the grandiose architectural achievements of his father or predecessor. King Djoser and his brilliant architect raised this new, unprecedented stone embodiment of his limitless divine power to entirely new, hitherto unimaginable heights, both literally and figuratively. Even the initial project for Djoser's funerary structure, as Jean-Philippe Lauer's research has shown, was already quite ambitious. It was to be a gigantic square mastaba of stone, not brick, which in itself was intended to remain for centuries as the largest funerary monument of its time. Initially, such a single-stepped stone mastaba was erected over the king's deep underground burial chamber, its shape still imitating the traditional burial mounds or flat mastabas of the preceding era. But then, thanks to the brilliant creative insight of the chief architect, who built a high stone enclosure in the palace facade style around this initial mastaba, two different architectural and symbolic models were innovatively merged in one grandiose funerary complex, the idea of an ancient burial mound or mastaba, and the idea of an eternal royal palace represented by the rectangular enclosure. The external appearance of this huge enclosure, faced with white limestone and decorated with niches, clearly imitated the sacred white walls of the royal palace in Memphis, unequivocally indicating thereby the inseparable connection of this funerary complex with the pharaoh himself and his eternal power. Within this vast enclosed space of 15 hectares were many different enigmatic structures, an entrance colonnade, temples, chapels, courtyards, pavilions, most of which were apparently purely symbolic, non-functional decorations, built of stone but imitating older constructions of wood, reed, and brick. Together, they created a kind of grandiose stone scenery, an eternal city for the king, against which the silent play of the most important royal rituals and mysteries, ensuring his rebirth and eternal reign in the afterlife, was to be eternally enacted. It is noteworthy and even unique that we know for certain the author of this revolutionary funerary complex, the first architect in human history whose name was not forgotten. His name was Imhotep, and this name has passed through millennia, forever becoming in later tradition a synonym for unsurpassed Egyptian wisdom, knowledge, and skill. His name and a long list of his high titles were modestly, but with the king's clear permission, carved on the base of one of Djoser's own statues, which was installed in the entrance hall of the funerary complex and, like a silent guardian, was to eternally gaze upon all visitors to this sacred place. True, this impressive service record of Imhotep, which included such titles as Keeper of the Royal Seal, First after the King of Upper Egypt, Steward of the Great House, i.e. the Royal Palace, Hereditary Nobleman, High Priest of Heliopolis, Greatest of Seers, Chief Overseer of Sculptors and Artists, does not directly state that he was the chief builder of the step pyramid. But he is undoubtedly the most likely candidate for this role, and it is precisely his supposed participation in this unique construction process that immortalized his name for centuries. Only he was the most powerful and influential man at King Djoser's court, after the pharaoh himself, and only he was удостоен такой беспрецедентной чести, быть увековеченным на статуе своего повелителя в его же гробнице, honored with such unprecedented distinction, to be immortalized on a statue of his master in his own tomb. It was Imhotep, it is believed, who during construction intuitively foresaw or consciously developed the revolutionary evolution of the royal tomb from the initial single-stepped stone mastaba to the unique six-stepped pyramid we see today, which became the tallest and most impressive structure of its time in the entire world. Probably, the very idea of a stepped form, symbolizing a stairway to heaven for the king's soul to ascend, was somehow already hidden in ancient Egyptian religious ideology, but the undoubted merit of its first brilliant embodiment in monumental stone, and moreover within an entire highly complex architectural ensemble, belongs precisely to Imhotep. His bold architectural and engineering innovations not only created the first masterpiece of stone architecture, but also marked the beginning of the glorious era of pyramid construction in Egypt, thereby determining the further development of all monumental architecture of the Old Kingdom for centuries to come. The successful construction of the first gigantic stone pyramid and its complex ensemble required such colossal organizational efforts and the mobilization of such enormous resources, both material and human, as the ancient Egyptians had simply never known before. For this, it was necessary to radically reform and significantly strengthen the very structure of the central governmental apparatus. And the first and most important step in this direction was, apparently, precisely under Djoser, the final establishment and formalization of the office of Chief Vizier, or Tijati. The vizier now officially headed the entire state administration and was subordinate directly only to the pharaoh himself. Thus, he was a kind of all-powerful chief minister or prime minister, endowed with enormous additional powers due to his exceptional closeness to the pharaoh. The information we have about Djoser's high court officials, incidentally much more detailed and numerous than about their predecessors from the first two dynasties, unequivocally indicates a significant increase in the complexity, structure, and professional level of the entire government during this period. For example, we know the names of such nobles as Ankh and Sepa, who managed the affairs of Nome administration, i.e., provinces. Anku was the overseer of the royal bark and responsible for the river fleet. The famous Husayr bore the honorary title Chief of the Royal Scribes and possibly headed the entire civil administration and education system. And Khasekhemwy controlled the work of royal workshops and was responsible for supplying the court. The old, somewhat archaic system of power organization, where key posts at court were mainly occupied by close relatives of the king, often combining unrelated positions, gradually gave way to a new, more structured, hierarchical, and possibly more open-to-talent bureaucratic system. In this new system, for the first time in the entire existence of the Egyptian state, a capable and diligent individual from broader strata of the population, not necessarily belonging to the royal family, could, at least theoretically, make a rapid and brilliant career thanks to his personal merits and loyalty to the king, as probably happened with Imhotep himself. One could say that if the Egyptians built the pyramids, then the pyramids themselves, in turn, ultimately created the Egypt of the Old Kingdom that we know, with its powerful centralized authority, complex bureaucracy, and unique culture. A vivid example of this quiet social revolution, taking place in the central government, can be the unique biography of a noble named Metchen, which has come down to us thanks to detailed inscriptions from his large mastaba in Saqqara, dating to the end of the 3rd or beginning of the 4th dynasty. This inscription is the first known detailed autobiography in Egyptian and world literature. From it, we learn with surprise how this Metchen, having started his career as a simple scribe in a state food warehouse, managed through his abilities and diligence to rise to the position of an official in provincial administration, and then to the highest post of nomarch, i.e., governor, of several rich provinces in the Nile Delta. The culmination of his long and successful career, when he was already one of the most influential and trusted courtiers, was the honorary appointment to the position of steward of the royal summer residence in the Fayum oasis. For many subsequent centuries, such a rapid and well-deserved advancement up the career ladder, based on personal merits and loyal service to the king, would become an ideal model for many ambitious Egyptian officials. Henceforth, the history of Egypt would be made not only by the divine-crowned heads themselves, but also by their powerful and influential nobles and ministers. The reign of Djoser and the grandiose achievements of his government and his architect Imhotep were so impressive and revolutionary that virtually all subsequent pharaohs of the 3rd dynasty pale in comparison. From most of Djoser's immediate successors who ruled after him, only their names in royal lists and on a few monuments have come down to us. These were kings Khasekhemwy, Kaba, and possibly Sanacht. None of them, as far as we know, left behind a funerary monument that could in any way compare in scale, complexity, and innovation with Djoser's step pyramid, although some of them, for example Khasekhemwy, did attempt to build their own step pyramids at Saqqara, but were unable to complete them. Only under King Huni, who is considered the last pharaoh of the 3rd dynasty and ruled from approximately 2600 to 2575 BCE, do we again see some signs of a revival of monumental construction and the sprouts of the future classical pyramid age of the 4th dynasty. If the famous but now heavily ruined and enigmatic pyramid at Meidum, which was originally stepped and then rebuilt into the first true pyramid with smooth sides, was indeed begun or completed under Huni, as many Egyptologists believe, then this means that this king also paid considerable attention to monumental construction and architectural experiments. Although at first glance the specific contribution of this pharaoh Huni to the future architectural glory of Egyptian civilization may seem not so significant compared to Djoser or Sneferu, in reality it may have been very great and important. Huni left behind not one gigantic metropolitan pyramid, but a whole series of much smaller but very interesting so-called minor step pyramids scattered throughout the country. These small, purely symbolic pyramids without internal chambers, which archaeologists are still finding in different parts of Egypt, are believed to reveal to us a clear and well-thought-out plan of the king to strengthen his presence and power in all regions of the country. The southernmost of these minor pyramids was built on the island of Elephantine, at the very southern borders of Egypt, a place that since ancient times had been a favorite for demonstrating the boundlessness of royal power. This small pyramid, as well as its associated administrative complex or palace, as inscriptions report, was called the Diadem of Huni. A second similar pyramid was erected somewhat further down the Nile, at Jebba, modern Edfu, the capital of the second Nome. A third, at El Kula, near ancient Hierakonpolis, center of the third Nome. A fourth at Tuk, near Nubt, Nakada, center of the fifth Nome. A fifth in sacred Abydos, center of the eighth Nome. In addition, remnants of similar minor step pyramids have been excavated much further north, at Zawiyet el-Mayitin in Middle Egypt, at Sayla on the border of the Fayoum Oasis, and even at Hut Harib, modern Tel Atrib, in the Nile Delta itself. Each of these places where Huni's pyramids were built was either the capital of one of the administrative district's nomes, or an important regional, religious, or economic center. Thus, a very distinct impression is formed that King Huni, concluding the era of the Third Dynasty, sought to establish a visible, monumental, and unified symbol of his supreme power and the state's presence literally in every province of his vast country. And judging by the finds at Elephantine, possibly part of this grandiose administrative plan was also the establishment, at each such provincial pyramid, of some center for the collection and storage of royal taxes and treasures. However, these small monumental structures scattered throughout the country were not just passive symbols of royal power and state unity. They probably also served as an important tool for everyday economic and administrative control. A small but clearly visible step pyramid, rising above the local landscape, was intended to constantly and vividly remind all local inhabitants of their obligations to the distant but omnipotent king, and above all, of the need to regularly and fully pay taxes, so necessary for the maintenance of the expanding government, army, and for financing new grandiose construction projects. From the perspective of the central government itself, these monuments and their accompanying administrative buildings, one in each important province, were intended to significantly facilitate the process of tax collection, standardize it, and make tax revenues from the entire country more regular and predictable. Thus, at the very end of the Third Dynasty's reign, the Egyptian pharaohs, relying on the extensive and increasingly professional bureaucratic apparatus they had created, as well as on a powerful ideology of divine kingship, seemed to have achieved their main goal, the establishment of almost absolute and unquestioning power over the entire country and its resources. Everything was ready for conducting the most grandiose, most ambitious, and most daring royal construction experiment in all of human history, the erection of the Great Pyramids of Giza. But that is a completely different story, the story of the Fourth Dynasty and the apogee of the Old Kingdom.